No. Okay, recording is in progress. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers for Explore Salem's Neighborhood History, my City of Salem colleagues, Kimberli Fitzgerald and Kirsten Strauss. Kimberli Fitzgerald has been a resident of Oregon for almost 30 years, where she lives with her husband and 3 daughters. Born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Kimberli holds a master's degree in city planning and historic preservation from the University of Pennsylvania and a master's in archaeology, CRM, from Adams State in Colorado. Currently, she's the Historic Preservation Officer for the City of Salem, where she has worked since 2009. Ms. Fitzgerald enjoys hiking, swimming, and sailing in her spare time. Kirsten Strauss holds a master's degree in public history from Portland State University, where her research focused on cemeteries and the early development of cities in the Willamette Valley. She is currently a planner for the Community Development Department at the City of Salem. She has lived here in Salem for the last 10 years. Kimberli and Kirsten, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Alice. I appreciate it. All right. So, hope everybody can see our slide presentation here. We're here to explore some of Salem's neighborhood history. I want to give you just a little outline of what we're going to talk about. We'll do a little bit of Oregon history and context. We'll learn about Santiam Calapooya, learn about Salem's Chinatown, historic downtown, Herbert Hoover's boyhood home, which is right here in Salem. And then we'll also talk a little bit about our current preservation program and how we work to interpret and preserve this history as we move forward in time. So first off, I want to talk about Salem's earliest residence, which is the Santiam Band of the Calapooya. The area that's now known as Salem was once called Chemeketa, which is also pronounced as Chemickety in the Calapooya language. I think one of the really interesting things about the Calapooya band is that it is a tribe made up of different groups of people who spoke different dialects of Calapooya. And so here in Salem, we saw the Santiam band of Calapooya. And one other cool word that I like to point out is the name of the river, which was Wallamoo or Wallame. So you can kind of hear how that was anglicized into Willamette as we recognize it today. This is a costume of the Calapooya as pictured by an early explorer in 1841. I've heard that this costume is pretty accurate, except for the shoes, and the guy who made this picture just did some Roman shoes because he wasn't quite sure what the shoes look like. So that's kind of an interesting little fact about this picture. This is a view of the Willamette Valley from about the 1840s. I think this is a really beautiful view of the valley and the river. And one of the things that I really like about it is it shows how meticulously managed the land was by Indigenous people from the area. They used fire to promote the growth of food that would last them through the winters. And so you see these wide oak savannas that grew camas, and they used the acorns from Oregon white oaks to eat and preserve for the winter time. So you can really see the evidence of that land management in these early photos of the Willamette Valley. The Calapooyan practiced a seasonal round, which means that they had light or no housing during the summer, and they moved to more permanent housing during the winter time. You can see here, this is sort of an example of what housing during the winter might have looked like. And Salem here, or Chemeketa or Chemickety, would have been sort of a winter town site for the Santiam Calapooya. It was right on the edge of territory with other Calapooya tribal members, and so it functioned a lot of the time as a trading port, a destination where you could kind of talk to other people, trade goods, kind of see what was going on. As we move forward in time, in the 1800s, you start to see Euro-American explorers show up in the area. Some examples of this are Lewis and Clark, 1804 to 1806, and then Astor's expedition in 1811 are just a few examples of these. There's a lot of interest in the Oregon Territory by many different nations around the world, but by about 1818, that kind of narrows down to Britain and the United States, who agree on joint occupation in 1818, which essentially means that they agree not to fight about it for a while. So that's the agreement that they made in 1818. One of the largest figures of this early Oregon history period is John McLaughlin. He's sort of colloquially known as like the father of Oregon. There's some very dramatic photos of him right here. He was the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company, which formed Fort Vancouver in 1824, which was sort of a main hub of trade in the area during this time period. And he was a pretty powerful player, especially for folks who are arriving over the Oregon Trail. He's pretty famous among that group of people. During this time period, there's a lot of very well-established trade networks between trappers, between Indigenous people, and all of the people who gather in this area of the world. There's a very high market across the world for furs, and so a lot of people come to take advantage of that in this area. The Santiam Kalapuya traded a lot of camas and wapato. I'm not quite sure if I'm saying that correctly, but it was a way to process. There were ways to process these materials that you could make them last through the winter very easily. So they were very popular trade items. One thing that happened as a consequence of these people coming in from all over the world is that disease really started to disrupt these really well-established trade networks that had been functioning for decades by the time you get to the 1840s. One historian, Robert Boyd, he estimates that the population of Chinookan and Upper Kalapuyan declined from nearly 15,000 to only about 1,900, or 88% from 1805 to 1841. And so by the time you see people like Jason Lee and other Methodist missionaries or other people coming over the Oregon Trail arrive here, a lot of these trade networks have been pretty uh, hurt by these, just the amount of people who have been killed by disease in the area. One thing I like to point out is this photo of Bush Park, actually right down here at the bottom. You can see evidence of the land management practices that Indigenous people used in the area. Still at Bush Park, there's a lot of camas. You see these really beautiful oak savannas. It's something that I like to point out that you can still see here in Salem today. So I encourage you to go look at it. Jason Lee arrives in Oregon right about the time when these diseases kind of reach a plateau of impact. He comes in about 1834, and he initially settles about 10 miles north of Salem, which is now the Willamette Mission State Park. You can see right up here. I think you can see my highlighting. Oh yeah, you can. That's exciting. So initially they settle right up here, and they establish a mission house to convert Indigenous children and teach Indigenous children in the area about Methodism. They also have a few different areas around the Oregon country. They have a place in the Dalles, and they also have a place down south, but this area here was their main place of operation. You can see here, this is sort of a photo of the house as they were built. And these are the ghost houses that you can see if you actually go to the Willamette Mission State Park today. So you can kind of see where those houses were. By the time that you get to the 1840s, a lot of the folks who were part of the mission at this time complain about flooding. There's a lot of mosquitoes, so people are kind of not excited about living here anymore. And they come down about 10 miles south to Salem proper, or what we now know as Salem proper, and establish this house right here. So they start construction in 1840, they finish in 1841, and this is the house that they build. It's the oldest still standing frame wood structure in the Pacific Northwest, I think. I think I got all those caveats right, but you can still see it. It's at the Willamette Heritage Center, and I encourage you to go check it out. It's a really cool house, and it was built in 1841, so it's definitely one of the oldest houses in the area and the oldest house in Salem. Um, this is a map. I don't know. I hope you can see the street names here, but this is the intersection of Liberty and High Street, and this is right where this house was located. This is E Street. Boone's Treasury is like right over here, if that gives you sort of a frame of reference. And I've included this fun photo down at the bottom because we were able just this last year to do some archaeology at the site. And Kimberly can talk more about that if anybody's got questions. But they were able to find the original foundation of the house while they did archaeology there, which is really cool. So some like very old bricks, and it was a very exciting project. So that's just one kind of cool way how the program continues to preserve this history that we are learning about today. Um, so this is a 1852 Oregon GLO map, which stands for the General Land Office. And this map, I think, is really great at showing the kind of impact that the missionaries had on the early development of Salem. Right up here, you'll see this is the house of J.B. McLean. He purchased the mission house from the missionaries after the mission was dissolved, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So you can see that's where this house was. The other area that the mission established was the Methodist Institute, also called the Manual Labor School, the Indian Manual Labor School, which is where they continued their missionary work and teaching Indigenous children about religion. There's a lot of interesting things, I guess, that could be said about the methods that they used in the 1840s. Maybe interesting is too gentle of a word. It really was not a great place for people to be, though they did think that they were doing the best that they could at that time. So, a lot of interesting conversations to be had about that, I think. But one thing that we see in our community still from the work of the Methodists here is Willamette University. The Methodist Institute eventually became, or was eventually sold to the Oregon Institute, which eventually became Willamette University. So you see some pretty strong ties between the university, between this organization of the state government, and then also Willamette University eventually. The last place that the missionaries used really early on here is the Jason Lee Cemetery, and that's still there. You can still go visit that as well. It's located right next to the Oregon State Hospital now. So you can kind of see that this is a pretty wide breadth of area that the missionaries covered while they're here in Salem. And that means that they had to have a lot of roads and streets in order to sort of support that movement around the city. Um, by the time that more people start to arrive here in the 1850s, Salem is pretty well established. There's roads, there is a plat, and it becomes a pretty appealing place for people coming across the Oregon Trail to settle. So we're going to zoom out just a little bit kind of to the wider contextual history and talk about the end of joint occupation. So by the 1840s, settlers in the area, the missionaries, they come together and they say, okay, we're going to form this provisional government. We're still kind of who's going to be in control of us. We don't know. It could be Britain, it could be the United States. We're going to form this provisional government, and there's some kind of funny language in there that says, until the time in which America takes us under her wing or something, which is kind of a funny thing to say because technically there's still, it could go either way. Technically the land could go to Britain or it could go to America. Eventually in 1846, Britain and America decide in the Treaty of Oregon on the 49th parallel as the division between their territories. And then the United States federal government formally recognizes the Oregon Territory in 1848. So now we can kind of go back to Salem. One of the big things that happens in this time period is the dissolution of the Methodist mission in 1844, and this is something I'm pretty fascinated by. One thing that the missionaries weren't really good at is doing any missionary work. They weren't successful really at converting anyone. Their school was a pretty sound failure for the Indigenous children in the area. And the Methodist Mission Board on the East Coast was really unhappy with Jason Lee's work in this area. They eventually send Reverend George Geary to come and dissolve the mission, and he does that in 1844. He sells off all of the missionaries' land, and he sells all of the things that they've sort of collected during their time here. But one thing that you do see is that missionary party members do pretty well when it comes to land speculation in the area, which is another complaint that a lot of people had about the Methodist missionary during that time period. William Wilson is an example of that. He was one of the first people to plat downtown Salem. You can see this area right here, with this being the capital. He was a former lay member of Lee's missionary party. He was a carpenter, if I'm remembering correctly. And he sold land to fund the Oregon Institute, or eventually Willamette University, and also the construction of the Capitol. So he did very well after the mission dissolved in the 1840s. And one thing I want to talk about here, so we'll kind of zoom just sort of to the Oregon level of context here. And I want you to pay close attention to the timeline of these. So you'll see that you'll remember that in 1848, the United States federal government recognizes the Oregon Territory. And in 1850, they passed the Donation Land Claim Act, which gives people essentially free territory in the Oregon country to come claim and settle and grow on, essentially. However, this Donation Land Claim Act happens before any treaties are ratified with Indigenous people in the area. And I think that's something really important to learn. It's not something that I learned until after I went to grad school. And it's something that makes me feel very passionately about sharing this history because I think it's an important fact to understand about how Oregon came about. But specifically for the Santee and Kalapuya, in 1851, they negotiated a treaty with the superintendent of Indian Affairs at the time, who was Anson Dart. And they negotiate this area for themselves, which this is about Jefferson right here. So this is east of Jefferson, just right up against the mountains. And this is the area that they claim for the Santee and Kalapuya. However, when this treaty is sent back to the federal government on the East Coast, they don't ratify the treaty, they don't agree to the terms, and they actually send a different superintendent of Indian Affairs to renegotiate treaties in 1855. The result of that is the Willamette Valley Treaty, which is a treaty among many different tribes in the area, not just the Santee and Kalapuya. And it forms the Grand Ronde Reservation. And then in 1856, you see forced removal of Indigenous people to the Grand Ronde Reservation, both Kalapuya and other people from surrounding areas. And I think this is also another very important thing to learn about when you're learning about Oregon history. A lot of this forced removal was very violent and really an unfair way to treat people who understood that they were treating with the, sovereignty to sovereignty. And when these negotiations really didn't go the way that they were expecting them to, it was reflected very poorly on the United States federal government. But when we go back to the state of Oregon, so we're kind of moving forward a little bit in time. And after the non ratification of the treaties, after the Donation Land Claim Act, Oregon becomes an official state in 1859. There's a lot of controversy over the capital location. Some people think it's going to be in Oregon City because that's a very prominent place for people coming from the Oregon Trail. There's also a lot of movement to have it in Corvallis, which is the location of one of the biggest colleges during that time. And there is a very unsubstantiated rumor that the first capital burned because someone wanted the capital actually moved down to Corvallis. I've never verified that. It's just a rumor, so don't quote me on that. But it's kind of a fun rumor. But this is the first Capitol building right here. It burned just right after it was completed, and they didn't complete the second Capitol building until 1876. And then this cool dome was added in 1893. And they actually met in this building downtown in some of this intermeeting time. This is the Holman building. It's located on Commercial Street. They're actually building a new hotel there soon. It's going to be called the Holman Hotel, or at least it's gone through historic design review and that kind of approval. So it'll be interesting to see how they interpret the history of this site. All right. One thing that is really controversial about the founding of Oregon as a state is Oregon exclusion laws. You'll note that Oregon becomes a state in 1859, which is just a couple of years before the Civil War starts on the East Coast, which starts in 1861, so just a couple of years difference. And the way that Oregon sort of negotiates this tension between whether they're going to allow slaves in the state or not is to simply not allow Black people in the state at all. That's where these Oregon exclusion laws come from. It's the only state admitted to the Union that has exclusion laws. And there are sort of various laws over the provisional and territorial governments, but then it becomes an official state with exclusion laws. They're sparsely enforced. There's not really a lot of evidence that they were ever enforced, which means that we have a lot of cool stories and evidence about people who lived here, Black people who lived here in Oregon. But it definitely discouraged Black people from coming and living in Oregon. And Oregon still today is one of the least diverse states in the Union, partially because of these exclusion laws in the 1850s and 60s. A few early Black residents in the area that I think it's really interesting to highlight their stories are Jackson Bonter. He was a painter who arrived in 1855, so very early in the timeline of Oregon history, well before it was a state, or at least a few years before it was a state. And he lived here with his family for quite a long time until he died, and he's buried in the Salem Pioneer Cemetery. Another really interesting person, I think, is Rachel Belden Brooks and her husband, Nathan Brooks. This is actually their wedding certificate, which they have at the Oregon State Archives. So that's kind of fascinating. I think Rachel is really interesting because she actually arrived in Oregon as a state of Daniel Delaney, who was a pretty wealthy landowner in the area. He died in 1866, and she sued his estate for the exact amount of money that he had paid for her when he bought her as a slave. She won the suit, and she lived the rest of her life happily in Salem until she died in her 90s in 1910. So she was able to use that money after Delaney died to live a good life here in Salem. You can see names of other folks who are buried in the Salem Pioneer Cemetery. This is a memorial that the Oregon Black Pioneers put up at the cemetery. I really encourage you to check out both that organization and this memorial because I think it's a very fitting tribute to some of these early pioneers in the area. So as we move forward in time, we see a lot of increased development. This is just kind of a photo of a farm like 10 miles south of Salem, but it kind of gives you an example of like what this area looked like. And this is an 1861 GLO map, and you can see this is how a lot of the land in Salem is being divided. This is like Salem proper. So like right here is downtown. William Wilson, you'll note his name from earlier. And if you know about any of the missionary parties, you'll see that a lot of these names will sound familiar. So a lot of the missionary folks came out very well when it came to Oregon becoming a part of the Union. Just a cool couple of houses to focus on here are the Falk House and the Smith Amherst House, 1870 and then 1876. These are houses that I think are fun to highlight because they're quite obviously part of a much larger estate. They both face towards Commercial Street, where if you were to build a similar kind of house today, they would definitely face on these roads right here. So you can tell that the neighborhood was really built up around them in a way that's not always obvious at other historic houses. They're really beautiful. I love these houses. And here is Salem in 1876. One thing that's note is that the Capitol faces this way, and you can kind of see the extent of the city during that time period. Of course, there's a lot of industrial work that comes because the Willamette Valley is very bountiful. It's easy to grow things here. And so you see evidence of that in flouring mills and woolen mills and food processing areas that really employ a lot of people in the town. And it becomes sort of a processing site and a processing center for people who are coming to the area. There's also a lot of commercial growth downtown. This is just kind of a fun little photo of a few buildings downtown. You can kind of see the timeline of when they were built. This is a photo from, if I'm remembering correctly, I should have written the date down, but it's from, I think, the World War I victory parade, so about 1919. And you can kind of see how these buildings have changed a little bit here. This is actually one of my favorite buildings downtown. It's very cool. It was built in the 1850s, so it's quite a bit older than some of the ones nearby it. And it's still there, actually. It's just like been turned into this funny little drive-through. I think it's very cool. I love it. And of course, with increased commercial and increased industrial, you're going to have a lot of international immigration for folks coming to take advantage of those opportunities. And I'm going to let Kim do this part because she's the real expert on Chinese history in the community. So go ahead and take it over, Kim.
Oh gosh, well, thank you, Kirsten. Yeah, so I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about the Chinese in Salem and the Chinatown that was here. So it was really fascinating. We've done a lot of work in the last, I guess 4 or 5 years, really growing our understanding of this really very fascinating population. So you can see on your screen there a couple of really cool photos. So George Sun, he was locally known as the mayor of Chinatown. And yes, they did have their own representative who spoke for the Chinese immigrants with our local mayor and to help advocate for their rights. You can see him with two of his children standing in his store, which was in downtown Salem. And then in the lower right-hand corner, you can see this is a funerary table. That's in the picture is actually the parks director. This was a project that we did out in the cemetery. We dug in the cemetery. It was covered over, and we worked with Willamette University and also our current local Chinese population to help uncover that. And I'll talk a bit about that a little bit more in the next few slides. So if you can go to the next slide, great. Yeah. So the area known as Chinatown in downtown Salem moved around a bit. So you can see 3 different maps here on the right-hand side of your screen. And you can see the different colored building footprints kind of show where it was initially in 1880, and then it grew a bit, kind of spread around. You can see by 1895. And then by 1915, it had really concentrated down south to across the street from where the Elsinore is right now. And we had a lot of questions about why that was. And in addition to trying to figure out that mystery, we were also looking at the population statistics. So the table there on the left-hand side of your screen kind of shows the population over time from the federal census between 1860 and 1930. And the census reflected that a majority of the Chinese in Salem were men who worked as laborers, cooks, and laundry workers. However, some stayed and they married and had families. And we found it interesting to really look at the number of Chinese born as a percentage of all the foreign-born people who had immigrated and were living here in Salem. So for example, in 1880, while there were just 89 Chinese-born people here in Salem, they were 35% of the overall foreign-born population, which is pretty significant, and actually a similar percentage to other cities that were bigger, that had larger numbers, like Portland or San Francisco. And that number decreased significantly by 1930. And so we set about trying to understand why. Before we jump to the next slide, though, I do want to point out in the center, there's a picture of one of our interpretive wraps around a utility box there in downtown, right near 440 State Street. So if you want to learn really more about this and you're walking around downtown, take a look at that wrap. So yeah, jump to the next slide, Kirsten. And so why did they leave? Why did they move down? Why were they stuck on that one block? So the Chinese Exclusion Act, I'm not going to go to a deep dive here. There's been a lot of really great work done on that, but Salem experienced the impacts, especially the Chinese community. Kirsten had talked about the exclusionary laws for the Oregon Blacks that were moving here or trying to move here and chose not to because of that exclusionary language. There was definitely laws passed at a national level, but also locally, which impacted Salem's Chinese. And definitely also there was sort of a prevalent kind of bias against the Chinese here in Salem that was even still reflected in 1961. So Ben Maxwell, maybe many of you have heard of him. He wrote the only narrative that we could find when we started really digging deep about the Chinese in Salem. And he referred to the Chinese in a not really great positive way. So you can see here also that the local newspaper there in that top left-hand corner, there's an article that we discovered, which the Salem City Council condemned Chinatown. This picture shows a few of the smaller wood frame buildings that were still around. They're at the northeast corner of Liberty and State. And it was known as Varani Corner. You can see a frame of a bell tower kind of in the background. And Ben Maxwell had written about that. And he referred to the bell tower as a body house and stated that Varani Corner at State and Liberty was a Chinese den, and complaints about these Chinese rookeries and what went on within them was frequent and constant. And so from what we understand, as a result, the Salem City Council chose to condemn this block, which is a big reason why they moved down south to across from the Elsinore. So we had originally thought, well, maybe that was the end of Chinatown back in 1903, but that wasn't the case. They just moved and they remained there on that block across from the Elsinore until the block was redeveloped in 1924. And the Hughes building, which is still there today, that was constructed in 1924. He redeveloped the block on the east side of High Street, which is north of Ferry, constructing a hotel. And so the picture on the previous slide where you saw George Sun and his family, his store was on this block. And so many of the Chinese families like George Sun moved to the outskirts of Salem. Something to point out that the Chinese weren't allowed by law to own property, but some were creatives like Hop Lee. There's a picture, his Chinese name is Lo Sun Fook there with his beautiful family. His wife was actually born in the United States, and so they were able to own land. They had businesses in downtown Salem, but then moved to the outside of Salem, and he had a 612-acre hop farm, and he died in 1925 and was buried on his land outside of Salem. And his remains were disinterred, which was a Chinese tradition, and sent back to China. Yeah, we again, back to that project we did out at the cemetery. Here you can see in the center of the slide that Salem's current Chinese population were able to celebrate what's called the Qingming Festival, which is very similar to our Memorial Day. That we've been celebrating it every April, and we're even able to celebrate it this year. We couldn't do it last year. But the excavation itself was very successful, and we were able to recover some artifacts and even found some headstones that were returned from a neighbor, and learned more about their traditions of disinterment and returning remains back to China. If you want to learn more about that, again, there's another utility wrap out at the Pioneer Cemetery where you can dig in and learn more about the funerary traditions. And we did do an exhibit at Willamette Heritage Center for a while, and we're looking to do some more in the future. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kirsten so she can share some interesting information about the history and growth of Salem's residential neighborhoods.
Thank you, Kimberly. Okay, perfect. So we'll jump into residential growth. So if you're going to have commercial and industrial growth, you have to have somewhere for folks to live. And we see a lot of residential growth in Salem in the 1890s through the 1930s, and continued still, but you do see a lot of growth during these time periods. This is also the time period when we have a couple of our historic districts that have come into place. We have our Court Schmeketa Historic District and the Gady Hill and Bush's Pasture Park Historic District. And Kim's going to talk a little bit more about those later, but these are just a few houses from those districts. You've got these two Victorian houses, this really beautiful bungalow, and then kind of a more modern, like Spanish style house up on the hill, built in 1929. So this is just to remind you of the 1876 map. Note there's no bridge, note the orientation of the Capitol so that you can compare it with our 1905 map, which now has a bridge. You'll see that the growth past the Capitol is quite a bit further. You can see the Oregon State Hospital, you can see the prison. This corner right here is the Pioneer Cemetery, so it kind of gives you a sense of scale for how much Salem has developed by this time. And one of the reasons why we see development of residential growth in these patterns is actually because Salem once had a streetcar. I think this is great. We should bring back the streetcar. This is like the hill that I will get on top of. We had the streetcar from 1889 to 1927. And you'll see that it stubs sort of at some of these places that are large state employers. So the Oregon State Hospital, the prison, it'll go up to the fairgrounds. And we even have some like cool newspaper articles about people taking the streetcar down to the cemetery. So it was well used during its time. It fell out of favor in 1927 simply because buses were less expensive to run. And we see buses sort of overtake that public transit need in the city during that time period. And speaking of the streetcar system, this is a great time to talk about Herbert Hoover, because as he lived here as a teenager, he actually worked on the streetcars. So that's kind of a fun fact about Herbert Hoover. He lived in Salem from 1888 to 1891, and this is the house that he lived in with his uncle. His uncle owned the Oregon Land Company, and they also lived in Newburgh, I believe that's correct. So they have a house museum dedicated to Hoover and his uncle in Newburgh, but he also lived in Salem. This house is still there. You can go see it. It's located along Hazel and Highland Avenue. However, it is remodeled, so you might not recognize it as this house here, but a cool fact about Salem. A little bit more residential growth in North Salem. These are houses from the Grant neighborhood, and you see a lot of different and cool styles in this neighborhood. We have some revival styles like colonial revival, English cottage revival. You also have these really beautiful bungalows, which you see a lot of bungalow styles in Oregon. I think they're one of my favorite styles. I love these. You can see this one has this sort of side porch. We also have this sort of simple like pyramid style with some Victorian detailing. So these are some cool styles that arrive sort of during that time period. But one big event that really affects the way that Salem develops, and one thing that I think really jump-started this urge to modernize the city was the Capitol burning in 1935. Here's a couple of photos of it burning. This is it actually on fire, and then this is sort of the aftermath of the fire. And this really effectively does a couple of things. One, it reorients the city. And two, I think it really creates a fascination for a lot of like government folks, for a lot of private folks to modernize the city to match this new fancy capitol that they build and finish in 1938. And this is just a little photo of the map, just to kind of give you a sense of scale for the reorientation of the Capitol building. So this is our 1876 map that we've looked at before, and you can see that the Capitol is facing towards the river. When they rebuilt, they refaced it north, so the river would be this way. And so here is our modern Capitol Mall right here, whereas it used to face this way going towards the river. So you can see that was a pretty big change. And you can still see if you visit this park that is located to the west of the Capitol building today. This is like where the flag area is. I can't remember its proper name. But you can kind of see some of resemblance of the former orientation of the Capitol building. And there's also like a fun horse fountain at the corner right over here, which is one of my favorite things to look at when I go over there. So you should go check it out. And this is a beautiful photo of our very modern Capitol building. I know a lot of people, I feel like there's a reputation that it's not very cute, but I love the Capitol building. I think it's very cool. It's very modern, very fun. I like it. And this is just a little photo so you can kind of get a sense for the reorientation. This is our courthouse, this is the post office, and this is the Capitol. And then this is sort of that same view taken from Google Earth. And you can sort of orient yourself by using the church here, which is in the same location. So you can kind of see how that looks different today. A lot more trees, which is nice. But one sort of effect of that reorientation is that the residential neighborhood that was just to the north of the Capitol is either demolished or moved. And so you see a lot of these homes in the area. Some of them do get moved, so you can find these houses in other areas of Salem now, but a few of them did get razed, and I think one of the most significant examples of this is the Patton House, which was razed in 1939. So you can actually see the Capitol in the background here. It's a really beautiful, fancy house built very early in our time period, and we don't have a lot of houses built this early since a lot of them were located in that area. And this is just sort of some evidence to support my theory that that Capitol really jump-started modernization in Salem. This is in 1940, so just a few years after that initial completion of the state capitol building. This is the building that we're looking at right here. And then you can see here in 1940, they announced this very cool, very modern for 1940 building that they are going to create. And then you can still see it here today. This is one of my favorite buildings downtown. I love it. I think it's really cool. I love this 1940s style. And I think it's really beautiful. And then this is just another example of that. This is the white building. Named because of its color, very creative. It was built in 1874. It's remodeled in 1948, so just a few years, about 10 years after the Capitol. And then this is what it looks like in 2018. So you can see sort of how that modernization transfers to other parts of the city. Another big event that happens during the 1930s and 40s, obviously, is World War II. It really affects everyday life in Salem. This is a picture of Mr. Scrap Iron Scrappo, who was put together by some, I think like local scrap yards as incentive or sort of advertising for people to contribute their scraps to these collection points so that they could be repurposed for other uses during the war. You also see a lot of changing home styles during this time period as veterans return from the war. Suburbs grow, people have a lot more cars. They become a lot more important part of land use during this time period as well. And then just a fun fact about this photo, actually, it's one of the salvage committee chairmen. He said it's one of the biggest tires in captivity, which is one of the things that they said to kind of I don't know, advertise, talk about this like event that they were doing. It's apparently weighed 1,700 pounds, so that's kind of a funny little fact about that tire. Another really big program that happened during World War II is the Bracero program. And this really shaped and helped the Willamette Valley a lot during World War II. Of course, there was a draft during World War II, and so a lot of the folks who would have provided labor at farms, at railroads had been drafted and were now fighting overseas. And so in 1942, there's an executive order to fill these labor shortages with Mexican nationals. So they come to America. A lot of people in California, but they also come up to Oregon, and some come to Washington as well. They're guaranteed wages, they're guaranteed health care, and they're guaranteed housing in exchange for labor. A lot of this labor is in the form of farming, but you also see folks working for the railroad as well. So this is taken right over by about Woodburn, is this where this article is from. And this, I wish this picture was better, but that's the best scan I could get. In Salem, there's a lot of braceros who are housed at the Oregon State Fairgrounds during this sort of initial part of the program. The program's pretty successful initially. It really helps cement America's success during World War II because they are actually able to fill a lot of these labor shortages that would have left people hungry during World War II if they'd not been able to fill them. But there's not very good oversight for the program, and so a lot of braceros are eventually left with very poor working conditions, no oversight, and the program eventually collapses and is no longer renewed. There's also a lot of sort of tension with people who are coming into the area, both with people who are not providing the services that they're supposed to provide for the program, but also in the community as well. But we do see really interesting interactions with Mexican and Americans during this time period. The mayor of Salem during the time period goes to celebrate Mexican Independence Day at the state fairgrounds with the braceros. So that's what this article is about here. And this is just an article saying that there's 5,000 people who are part of this program or who are coming up to Oregon. This program is really influential in creating networks for people who can then eventually pursue citizenship in America. Today, nearly 20% of Salem's population identifies as Hispanic or Latino, and a lot of them can trace their roots back to this initial program. So very, very successful program for helping America through World War II. And then here's some just changing styles for the 1950s and 1940s and 1950s. You see these sort of simple styles that are popular with vets returning, and also the ranch style of housing becomes very popular during this time period as well. As we move to the 60s and 70s, we see more demolition and more modernization. This is the demolition of the Marion County Courthouse and then the City Hall. And there's sort of a national trend for this urban renewal that we see, and I think has started a little bit earlier in Salem because of this sort of desire to be modern and to match the state capitol building. But you do see evidence of that through the 1970s. And of course, if you tear down the old City Hall, you need a new one. And so in 1968, this is Vern Miller. He started a campaign for a new civic center, which I'm actually sitting in it today. So that's something that is still around. It was finished in 1972, and it was really conceptualized as this center where you could come and get all of your government services that you needed. So it has the library, it still has the library, it will once they're finished with construction over there. And this is sort of a picture from its initial opening. And I have a sound clip from these campaigns, so I'm hoping that you can hear it. So Kim, you should give me like a thumbs up if you can hear it. Okay, great.
You are here this evening because you are a responsible citizen, a citizen concerned about Salem, its present and its future. I am Dr. Vern Miller, and I'm proud to serve as the mayor of Salem, a city of concerned and responsible citizens like you. In the next few minutes, you are going to hear about a problem, your problem, because it's Salem's problem, and you're going to be asked to make a decision which can provide the solution for Salem.
So they would actually, it was on a physical record, and the physical record would accompany like a flipboard that would, he would be like, next page, and then the flipboard would have a photo or something that correspond with what he was talking about on the record. So you could take both the record and the flipboard to like a neighborhood association meeting or around town, which I think is a really interesting and cool way to advertise this project. So just a cool little fun snippet from that. Oops, okay, don't have to listen to it again. As we move into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, I think we see this interesting transition back into like a desire to preserve history in a way that we haven't necessarily seen in Salem before that. A good example of this is the Capitol Tower here. You can see in 1927, this is the historic facade, but around 1970, it's got this sort of black tile facade. But in the 1990s, there's a renovation project that happens to restore this historic facade. So you sort of see this change of historic preservation come to the city during that time. There's also a lot of neighborhood associations that come into being during this time. This is the original boundaries for the Hoover Community Action Association, which named for Herbert Hoover, of course, right? This is very similar to the boundaries of the Nesca Neighborhood Association now. So you see the formation of neighborhood associations during this time period as well. And with that, we are done with my section. And so now we're going to hand it over to Kim, and she's going to talk to you about how we use this history to inform our historic preservation program today.
Great, thank you so much, Kirsten. So I'm going to share with you just a bit of history of how Salem's historic preservation program kind of came to be, especially as it relates to our historic districts and historic neighborhoods, and then leave you with some information about how you can enjoy more of Salem's history through some walking tours. So early preservation efforts began, like when Kirsten mentioned, actually after the Capitol was built and when those modernization efforts began. So the very first really, it was unfortunately unsuccessful fight was initiated by state archivist David Dunaway, and he was trying to save the Holman building, which I think Kirsten referenced in her earlier discussion about the Capitol, and the legislature met here for a while. And interestingly enough, Pietro Belluschi, a pretty famous architect, he built the Marion Car Park, which you can see pictured here at the bottom of your screen, in 1950, which was recently demolished to make way for this new hotel, which will be called the Holman Hotel, which is in the process of going through permitting. So hopefully they plan to construct end of this year or early next year. So you should be seeing that soon. And they're going to be doing some historic interpretation on the site, so please look for that. And next slide. So another few examples of early preservation efforts you can see over at the Willamette Heritage Center today. So the Parsonage, Pleasant Grove Church, John Boone House, all really early examples of those settlement houses that were threatened during that modernization period, and they were relocated in the 1960s, and they were all listed on the National Register as Thomas K. Historical Park in 1974, which is one of the first listings in Salem. And so next slide. So in 1985, next, the Salem Historic Landmarks Committee, was established as a permanent commission, and ad hoc committees were established in 1978 and 1983 before that, mostly to establish our local register, our local landmark of historic buildings, and make recommendations to the City Council as required as part of our Goal 5 inventory. And so at this time, about 100 properties were designated. And after the work of this committee was completed, their work was transferred to the Planning Commission, and the Landmarks Committee was abolished until it was established again in 1985 as a permanent committee, and then eventually became its own commission. So the Gady Hill Bushes Pasture Park Residential District, located south of the Central Business District in Salem, was the first district listed on the National Register in 1986. Kirsten shared some photos of that earlier, and this district is really cool. I really love its cohesive collection of bungalows. You can see them sort of in the top middle there. I love bungalows too. They're on the west side of High Street. And then the Court Chemeketa district, the second residential district, established it's east of the Capitol, and it was listed in 1987. And then Salem's downtown commercial core was listed in 2001. And then the Oregon State Hospital was listed in 2008. And so we have, again, a total of 4 National Register districts and about 150 individually listed properties. So if you're interested, if you're driving around and you say, hey, I wonder if that house is designated, or you just want to play around on this map, you can find this on our website. And you can go to the next slide, Kirsten, and you can just type in the search and you can see if it's listed. And if it is listed, you can learn a little bit more about it. So that's all on our website. So we understand that it is an additional burden sometimes to own a designated historic property. So we do offer some local incentives, including we have a residential toolbox grant program, which can help folks with maintenance, and we even help fund seismic retrofit and that sort of thing. And we've offered these grants since 2011, which is really exciting. We're happy to be able to do that. The city of Salem became a certified local government back in 1986 when our commission became a real commission. And this is a program through the National Park Service. And so we've been able to take advantage of the additional funding that being a CLG offers us. And so one of the primary goals is educating the public about our local history. So doing stuff like this that we're doing tonight, but also doing interpretation around town, which is those interpretive wraps around utility boxes. And another great opportunity to learn more about your neighborhood is we've got something called the Salem Heritage Neighborhood Program. We've now worked with 2 different neighborhood associations, the Grant Neighborhood and the Cessna Neighborhood. And Kirsten, along with Sean, who they put together these great architectural handbooks. And Kirsten was sharing some photos from those on earlier slides that tell a little bit more about the architecture. And if you live in these neighborhoods, or if you're just interested, you can reach out. We have these available. And these heritage neighborhoods, there's no regulation involved, unlike the historic districts where we do regulate historic design. This is purely devoted to education and outreach. And so another thing I just wanted to mention that we've made a concerted effort to interpret the history of underrepresented communities of late. In the National Historic Preservation Act was established in 1966, and we celebrated 50 years in, wow, it's 2016. And so since that time, and this is kind of a national effort, you can see here there were recommendations by the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. So that's what motivated us to really learn more about our Chinese community, but we have a lot of other histories that we're learning to uncover more information about. So Kirsten mentioned the 43 Oregon Black pioneers that are buried in our cemetery. And we just embarked on a new project with the Bush House Museum, which is a city-owned museum. And we're working to reimagine the interpretation there to sort of reflect a more unbiased view of the history at that time, and not just the perspective of Bush, the old white guy. So we're working on doing a better job of that. And so look for more of that to come. And then
there's 5 minutes left.
Great, I've got one more slide.
Okay.
So the last thing I just want to leave you with is, so Salem's Culture and Heritage Forum, which is a group of leaders from our historic and cultural nonprofits here in Salem have been working really hard this last few months. Actually, we got a grant from the Heritage Commission to pull together an updated walking tour brochure, which is going to be both available in print and online, which can help you better experience your neighborhoods here in Salem. And if you haven't been yet, you can visit their website at salemcultureandheritage.com. And there's videos on there, like there's one pictured here, Women of Mission, which is a short, very educational, very interesting video that talks about Lord and Scriver and a number of very interesting things that they did there and their work, not just at Deepwood, but also there along Mission Street at Bush House and across the street at their home, where if you haven't been yet, you can visit their gardens there at Gaiety Hollow. So with that, I'm gonna close because I know we want to leave some time for questions if anyone has any. So thank you so much for having us.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be able to hear a little bit about the work you do for the city of Salem, and hopefully the attendees learned something or found out some interesting facts. I don't have any messages that came into me via chat for questions for the two of you, but everybody is welcome to submit them now if you like. I guess I can start off with one. Kimberli, what drew you to Salem? What do you find interesting in particular about our state capital?
Oh my gosh, well, a bit of my personal background. So even though I didn't grow up here in Oregon, my family actually took an original donation land claim in the McMinnville area. And so my parents so they now live in McMinnville. And so I've just really been drawn to this area for a long time. And one of the things that I love about Salem, and I feel very privileged to be able to work here, is their commitment to historic preservation, and not just not more about education and outreach and being able to work with the community so that we're doing meaningful work around not just keeping all the buildings the same, because that's not good for anyone, but about really connecting to that history in a meaningful way. And I think Salem is one of the very few communities where our council has committed to helping fund these local, like, toolbox grant, for example. Not very many local communities have that. And also more recently helping and supporting our archaeological program. So we've been working a lot with the tribes. So I think that their commitment is what's drawn me to be able to work here. And also the history is really exciting. I feel like the more I learn, I need to learn more.
Yeah, the more you learn, the more you don't know, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So there is a question from Jim. Do you know of any objections to the remodel of the Hoover boyhood home, or was there any plan to restore it to its former Hooverness?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I actually went out and met the owner, and this was, oh gosh, 5 or 6 years ago, and asked that question. And unfortunately, if a property isn't designated in Oregon, it requires owner consent. We just can't go and just automatically designate without
Retroactively.
Yeah, without permission. So in this particular case, the owner was not interested. And but however, he did agree to allow us to put a plaque just providing that information about it being the Herbert Hoover boyhood home. So that's what you can see if you want to go find it and visit it, that he allowed us to put the plaque there. So yeah,
it's not far from Salem's temporary location on Broadway. I found out by walking by it.
I think that, should that house ever change hands, and if any future owner might be interested, that's something that we can assist with financial incentives and that sort of thing. But yeah, right now it requires an owner who would want to put that, agree to that designation and put the money into it.
And
Absolutely.
all that entails, right?
Yeah.
We did get a comment that the history of early settlement, especially the treaties being negotiated but not ratified, is very interesting. I hadn't thought of how that dovetailed with the donation land claims. Explains a lot. Yeah, I think that's fair, that a lot of those early instances of discrimination carried through over the years.
Yeah, that's something that I learned during grad school, which I didn't have any idea before that. And I think learning about that and learning about the timing of those interactions between tribal nations and the federal government is one of the things that makes me really passionate about sharing this history, because I think it's really important context to understand like tribal relationships with the government today. So I think that's something that's really important to share, and I'm glad that that person was able to get something from that. That's great.
Mhm.
I was even really happy to learn more about that. It's something that so one of the great things I think our city council has done is signed a memorandum of understanding with both the Confederate tribes of the Siletz and the Confederate tribes of the Grand Ronde. And that MOU is really just about agreeing to communicate with each other about items of mutual interest. And so for many, I don't know, most people have probably heard about the land acknowledgements. Many people are doing those now. And one of the things that they're going to prioritize talking about, our city council along with the tribal councils, hopefully in the upcoming summer, is to talk about how to do these kinds of land acknowledgements in a respectful way. So
Right,
that
they can't just be perfunctory. They need
yeah, and so
to.
it doesn't feel like, oh, here's the colonizing culture, then again, just saying something without talking to us first. So
Right.
I think even just something you would think as simple as communication, it's really important to be really thoughtful about how to do that. And so again, that's one of the things I really love about working for the city of Salem, is that they are very, very thoughtful about things like that.
Good, that's good to hear. And I appreciated, Kirsten, too, that in your presentation, it was less about discoverers, right? Because that's not really correct, right?
No, there's been people here for thousands of years, and they manage the land as much as we might manage it through the planning department today. So just in different ways.
Mhm. And the Grand Ronde Library recently joined our library consortium. So that's still all being ironed out, but that's really good news. Well, I think if there are no more questions, we'll wrap it up. So I will upload this video to the library's YouTube page when it's ready. Sometimes Zoom takes a while to upload it and have it be ready, but I will send that out, and we'll make sure that I can send that link to everybody who signed up for the presentation in case they missed it or wanted to share it out more widely. But thank you so much to Kirsten and Kimberly, and this was great, and I look forward to doing more presentations together.
Thank you. We appreciate you having us.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Good night, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night.